For those of you that don't know, tonight marks the first time I have led a service since joining the clergy team here at Temple. But definitely not what I was expecting or going for. But to finish that sentence, to lead into the sermon part, this is not the first time that I have addressed this congregation from this very spot. Just about a year ago, I had the privilege of delivering a sermon during Shabbat services. Now that we're a year away from that moment, I have a bit of a confession. I was pretty nervous. Rabbi Greenstein had invited me. This is kind of a big deal. I don't know, I've sat where you guys are for a long time, but if you've never had the experience of being up here, the room looks a lot different. I wanted to make a good impression. I began speaking, and I don't know, I thought I was going okay. And those of you that were there that night a year ago, you probably don't remember anything I said, but you definitely remember what happened next. I was about halfway through the sermon, you're getting to the punchline, getting ready to make my big rhetorical point, and poof, the lights go out. All the way out. All the lights. And that answers the question that maybe you had when I was there. No, those are not skylights. There is no light that goes through those. Rabbi Greenstein said that it's never happened before. Regardless, there I was, standing in this very spot. Here I am, by the way, tempting fate. And thinking about the Talmudic dictum that sanctuaries ought to be built with windows. It was so dark, I could not see the words in front of my face. That had not been part of my plan. I have thought a lot about that moment over the last year. Standing up here, hoping to make a good impression, and suddenly an act of God, or at least an act of MLGW, threw me entirely off guard. By the way, I don't believe that God really had anything to do with the lights going out, but there is no way it's a coincidence that this week's Torah portion starts with instructions on how you kindle the lights in the sanctuary. Look it up. I am not exaggerating. But back to a year ago and being left off guard. It's not supposed to happen. A rabbi is not supposed to get caught off guard. A rabbi is always supposed to know what to do and what to say. And when you get a bunch of us together, inevitably, we'll start sharing our war stories of the time that someone tore the Torah, or someone dropped the Torah, or someone lifted the Torah straight into a ceiling fan. I know that last one is true because it happened to me. Year one of rabbinical school, Yom Kippur. Anyway, in all of these stories, the rabbi handles the situation perfectly without missing a beat, or at least that's what happens in the rabbi's retelling of the story. But regardless, when we think of rabbis, we think of emissaries of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and most importantly, allegedly, all-perfect God. But where does this idea come from? When we see rabbis on TV or in films, they're almost always portrayed as these wizened and all-knowing figures. They're also, if you notice, almost always men with long beards who are fresh off the boat from 1894. But that's a different sermon. But I'm convinced it's beyond just the media that gives us this impression of the rabbi as unflappable and perfect. In our own tradition, Reform rabbis once led Shabbat services wearing almost priestly vestments, white robes, every Shabbat. The robe, a garment that is meant to set one apart, and dare I say, even above the congregation. The author Stephen Fried recounts in his own childhood memories of attending synagogue that he was mesmerized by the rows of the confirmation pictures in the hall, all of which contained the rabbi in the center, robed, looking resplendent, and as Fried describes, appearing like a human Torah. By the way, human Torah, that's a great Purim costume. But here's the irony. This image of a religious leader set apart from the congregation, imbued by godly wisdom and gravitas, that doesn't come from our Torah. In fact, if we read the accounts of our leaders that are actually in the Torah, we see a very different image. Take Moses. Toward the end of this week's parashah, this week's portion, we find that even Moses has a breaking point. He's well into the Exodus, which began with the greatest series of miracles in human history. And at this moment, he's confronted by the Israelites who come to him in tears. What could possibly be so upsetting that would instill such mass despair? Mi yachilenu basar. Moses, we really want to eat meat. As a reminder, they get literal manna from heaven every day, twice before Shabbat comes in. It comes and feeds them and sustains them. But here in this moment, they go on saying that they want meat. And furthermore, we remember the fish that we used to eat for free in Egypt, that wonderful, idyllic utopia that we came from, that was filled with the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and lest we forget, the garlic. That's in the Torah. They said this in tears, in agony to Moses, a man who had risked his own life multiple times to lead a nation out of slavery to fulfill its destiny. It would take a saint to respond to their cries with grace. What comes next is a reminder that Moses is many things, but a saint he is not. Moses turns to God and says, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant, with me? And why have I not enjoyed your favor that you have laid the burden of this people upon me? Where am I to get meat to give all this people when they whine before me and say, 'Give us meat to eat'? God, I cannot carry all these people by myself, for it is too much for me. If you would deal thus with me, rather, God, kill me, I beg you, and let me see no more of my wretchedness." Moses is often exemplified as a quintessential model of leadership, and rightly so. And yet here in this moment, we see that even Moses has a limit. Even Moses says things that, in hindsight, he probably regrets. Perhaps that's a bit distressing, to see a person of authority having what I could only describe as a meltdown. Or perhaps it's validating, when we realize even our most esteemed leaders have moments just like us. Earlier in this portion, God instructs Moses on the selection of the Levites. The Levites served as the holy workers in the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. They were responsible for carrying the Mishkan through the desert, and later when the temple was built and being the choir that sang holy psalms. But first, they had to be made ready. They had to be authorized. They had to be, the word we would use, I suppose, is hired. So who authorizes the people responsible for serving as the link between God and Israel? We'd probably expect it to be God. I would. Or maybe Moses, maybe Aaron, one of the higher-ups. But that's not how they receive their authorization. Here in this week's Torah portion, we read the ritual requires that Israel itself send representatives, and bisamchu b'nei Yisrael et yadechem, lay their hands upon the Levites. The Levites receive their authority not from God, but from the trust and support of Israel. And that word for the act of hand-laying, bisamchu, it's a significant word. Every word in Torah is significant, but this one's significant. It's based on the same Hebrew word as smicha. That's the ceremony that turns seminarians into rabbis. It's worth noting that no supernatural element exists for this ceremony. When we become rabbis, we don't douse ourselves in manischewitz. We don't even hold a Torah scroll. We don't do anything that explicitly requires or implies that God is the one who ordains us, because that is not who ordains a rabbi. Instead, the way we become rabbis is when one other person lays his or her hands upon us. The ritual is meant as a reminder of our connection Not necessarily to the God above us, although that God is certainly there, but it's a reminder of the connection that we have to each other. And that forms my basis of understanding for the rabbinate. A rabbi is not a human Torah, neither in appearance or in character. A rabbi is not an intermediary between Israel and God. Rather, a rabbi is a partner with her or his congregation. And together in partnership, we strive toward holiness. Reflecting back on my first time at this bima, it wasn't quite what I had expected. It certainly wasn't perfect, and yet it was holy. It was a moment where we all remembered that there are forces beyond our control. It was a moment where we came together as a community. Returning to that idea of partnership, I want to offer an additional thought. For this model to truly work between rabbi and congregation, it takes more than the leader simply unburdening him or herself of the responsibility of single-handedly sustaining a congregation. For a congregation to truly thrive, it takes all of us offering our very best to this community. It takes Alyssa, Jack, and especially Laura, who's up here for the very first time leading us in music, who are here because they were called and they came. And it also happened a year ago. Despite the darkness, I finished my sermon, and if you weren't here, you might be wondering, well, how? If I had no ability to see the words in front of me. And I finished my sermon because when I was standing up here alone in the darkness, I wasn't alone for very long. Within seconds, Richard was up here standing next to me with his flashlight. So let me leave you with that challenge. Each and every one of us has a flashlight that we carry. Maybe not all of us have a literal one, but we all have a tool or a gift. We all have a light, one that we can share and one that Temple needs. What is your gift? And what is your light? And how is it that you will share it with all of us? As I begin this phase of my rabbinate, I am so grateful to be surrounded by the light of this congregation, especially tonight. I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to us working together on bringing holiness to our congregation, our community, and our world. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will.